Excited to be with y'all. Excited to be in this space together, and so curious where this year has taken each of us. It's funny to be starting in this role for both Vanessa and I. It's like I barely know you, Vanessa. You barely know me, and you all barely know each of us. And at the same time, we've each gone through these versions of something just wildly extraordinary and frankly unprecedented in this past year. And it seems like our most difficult days of the pandemic are behind us. And at the same time, I think I know myself well enough to know how easy it is to gloss over the difficulty that has come about in this season, because we bear symptoms of our pain and our suffering all the time. But in this time, on this Sabbath Sunday, we'd love to reframe our relationship with these symptoms, to remember them as memorials, like these lasting monuments to our experiences with and through hardship and difficulty and suffering, especially in this unprecedented year. I'm convinced that the only way out is through. And we'd like to offer you the invitation to go through this process of what we want to call remembering yourself. The biblical texts constantly bring us back to this idea of remembering, using this word in connection to a worship or Sabbath practice as a way to literally slow us down enough to see. We're going to model exactly what we're describing to give you a frame and to help you to know us a little bit better. And we'd love to start just by sharing where this year has taken us, and how we've felt that through this journey of what it has brought about in our bodies, what our bodies are carrying, and how we're processing from there. So Vanessa, where do you feel like the pandemic has taken you, and how do you feel it now?
Yeah, so during this time of COVID and quarantine, I feel like I'm learning a lot about the value of slowing down and sitting in solitude. Just before I moved to Seattle, I spent my last week of undergrad alone in quarantine. I missed out on final classes and last celebrations, and mainly I just missed out on, being with people. I spent much of that week feeling sorrow and grief for everything I was losing. But what I also began to recognize after the first few days was that I could more clearly hear my own thoughts. I had a revelation of how clouded my mind and body and spirit were with all of the noise and activity that filled my life every day, constantly. And when all that was taken away, what was left was God and me and all of the unprocessed emotion of 2020. By the end of that week, instead of feeling resentment, I actually felt gratitude for the alone time. And what I didn't know then was that that week was actually preparation for what my first few months would be like here in Seattle. Although, between classes and 2 part-time jobs, I mean, my days are certainly full, don't get me wrong. But I certainly still have more moments than I anticipated in which I'm in solitude. I moved to a brand new place in the middle of a pandemic, and at this point, classes and much of my work is still over Zoom. But I again find myself circling back to gratitude, because I know that that time alone also means time to connect with God and with myself. And as I look to the coming months with the anticipation of the world opening up more and more, I feel excited, but I also feel cautious. I've found this new rhythm in this season in which I feel a greater sense of agency with, how much I pile on my plate of obligations. I don't want to simply revert back to those old habits of filling my time, and in doing so, drown out the voice of God. So as the world prepares to enter this new chapter and begins to open back up, I find myself asking, how much do I want to take on? And how much can I take on?
Hmm.
I just resolve within myself to hang on to the sacredness of solitude, even when there's temptation and opportunity to settle back into that routine of busyness.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just like, I think a few things came up for me, like as you were sharing. I just kind of like pictured like like dust being in the air, like in those moments of solitude where it feels like everything is kicked up, and the strangeness of having some gratitude amidst what has been just like such a wild um, season. I'm so grateful for the ways that like COVID has like this season has really like taught me to slow down. Yeah, I'm curious if you could like speak a little bit more to what that inner conflict is like for you.
Being in quarantine that last week of undergrad, I felt so much grief because I felt like I was missing out on so much. And it's funny because sometimes now when I think about the world opening back up, I find myself going back and feeling almost grief over that. Um, because in so many ways, like this time has been, frustrating and limiting and nerve wracking and scary and full of unknown. But it's also been a time where there's kind of, it's like the world is taking a collective breath.
Hmm.
I mean, the fact is, like, we have all experienced this very huge and in many ways traumatic experience as, as a collective, as globally. Um, and I don't think it's going to be, quite that easy to kind of just return back to normal. I think that inner conflict for me often looks like feeling grief over wanting that normalcy to return, but then also feeling grief over um, realizing that like this time has been so precious for me in so many ways, and like that's altering, yet again.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing that. I hang on that onto that part of what you shared in your story because it's so like latches onto my story as well. I find that I'm someone who is often an idealist and has these like lofty, ambitious goals and expectations for myself. Like I started uh, quarantine last year and like started doing this like fitness group with some of the people that I lived with, and I was like doing these like circuit workouts every day, which was super fun. I was so disciplined in like stretching and doing a lot of like yoga. And I think where this season has taken me has so just like fluctuated by way of like where I am, what I'm doing, what I'm not doing. For me, some days have been more difficult than others, wherein it like even just mustering the strength to get out of bed, let alone like carry on with my day, has been challenging. I think like you talked about like this collective breath, and I like feel that in this space, like whew, like this season has been exhausting. And I think that like what I'm learning of this time for me and like what it's teaching me is just like learning to yield to the exhaustion and to honor the sacredness of like where that finds me, to listen to like what it wants to tell me, and to do what I can to keep going, even when the ways that I cope with life stress aren't exactly, they aren't ideal. They aren't what I'd like them to be. I think holding myself loosely to say like, man, I'm a full-time grad student with two part-time jobs. I moved in the middle of the pandemic. Like there's a lot of space for grace in the middle of all of that like transition and all of that activity.
As you were sharing that, I mean, in so many ways, again, right? Like we talk about this collective breath, and I think there's so many ways in which everyone's experience of what this year has been, does vary. And yet at the same time, it's like there's just these common threads that we all just sort of get it. And so, like, no one could have foreseen what this year has brought at all. And so I think there is something to be said, sure, for finding new disciplines in this time and using this time well. But I find that the grace that I often have to have on myself is realizing that sometimes being the best steward over this season means sitting in whatever emotion I happen to be feeling in that moment.
Hmm.
And that honoring myself and honoring God and honoring my time sometimes comes by just sitting in the muck of negative emotion or grief or laziness or whatever that looks like, and realizing that like that's okay.
Right.
There's a centuries old spiritual practice called the exercises that we actually want to leave you with to help you set intentions to remember yourself, that idea that Chris was sharing with us earlier on. Sit with those questions as long as you need. Go back over them, journal, process it with another human being in your household, and think about how you want to memorialize the last year of this pandemic. How do we open ourselves back up? How do we remember?